Have you ever truly stopped to consider why some people seem capable of learning in half the time, absorbing complex ideas with surprising ease and retaining them for years, while others dedicate endless hours to studying, rereading the same material repeatedly, only to feel confused, overwhelmed, and unable to recall what they supposedly learned just days before? Why is it that one individual can read a book once and remember its core arguments for life, confidently discussing its insights in conversations years later, while another person revisits the same page 5 times in a single night and still forgets the central idea the very next morning? What if I told you that this difference has very little to do with raw intelligence, natural talent, or being born with a so-called good memory, and that instead it comes down to something far more practical, far more controllable, and far more powerful than most people realize? It comes down to a method, a specific way of approaching knowledge that used to be widely practiced, deeply respected, and intentionally cultivated inside classrooms, but that has slowly and almost invisibly disappeared from modern education systems. This study method was removed from schools not through an official announcement, not through a dramatic policy change, broadcasted to the public, but through gradual replacement, subtle shifts in priorities, and structural changes that almost nobody questioned at the time. Let me ask you something that might feel slightly uncomfortable. When was the last time you were taught how to think deeply, critically, and independently about a subject, instead of simply being instructed what to think, what to memorize, and what to repeat on an exam? When was the last time a teacher deliberately challenged you to defend your perspective in front of others, to debate opposing viewpoints, to question assumptions, and to actively dismantle weak arguments instead of quietly copying bullet points from a presentation? Instead of that kind of mental engagement, what most people experienced was a system built on slides, notes, memorization, standardized tests, and a repetitive cycle that rewarded compliance more than curiosity, and repetition more than reasoning. Here is the uncomfortable truth that many people resist hearing. The most powerful learning method in history was never designed around memorizing information, passively absorbing lectures, or highlighting paragraphs in a textbook. It was built on questioning information relentlessly, arguing with it when necessary, breaking it apart into smaller pieces, analyzing its assumptions, and rebuilding it with stronger foundations that could withstand intellectual pressure. That method is known as the Socratic method, a system of learning rooted in disciplined questioning and structured dialogue that shaped some of the greatest thinkers in history and formed the backbone of elite education for centuries. Ancient Greece relied on it to train philosophers and leaders. The Romans adopted it to sharpen rhetorical skill and legal reasoning. And for a long time, some of the most respected law schools in the United States structured entire classes around it rather than traditional lectures. Instead of sitting quietly while a professor delivered polished explanations, students were interrogated with probing questions, forced to articulate their reasoning clearly, and challenged publicly whenever their arguments contained contradictions or weak logic. Instead of receiving comfortable answers, they received uncomfortable questions that pushed their minds beyond memorization and into analysis, synthesis, and original thought, which is precisely where genuine learning begins to take root. If I simply hand you an answer, you'd temporarily borrow my understanding and may repeat it convincingly. But if I ask you a sharp strategic question that forces you to build the answer yourself, you create neural pathways that are uniquely yours and far more durable. Which of those two experiences do you think will last longer in your memory, shape your thinking more deeply, and influence your decision-making years from now? Imagine a classroom environment where, instead of hiding behind silence and scribbling notes mechanically, you were required to defend your ideas in front of your peers, respond to objections in real time, and adapt your reasoning under intellectual pressure. Yes, that scenario can feel intimidating because it exposes your thinking and leaves no room for passive participation. But it is precisely that exposure that accelerates growth and transforms fragile knowledge into solid understanding. This method was powerful because it forces what modern cognitive science calls active recall, which research consistently shows to be one of the most effective strategies for strengthening long-term memory and deep comprehension. When you struggle to retrieve information without looking at your notes, your brain is not malfunctioning or failing. It is actively reinforcing neural connections and making future recall faster, more reliable, and more automatic. Struggle, in this context, is not evidence of weakness but a signal of adaptation. Because growth occurs when the mind is challenged beyond comfort and required to produce rather than simply consume information. Over time, however, educational systems shifted toward efficiency, scalability, and standardization, prioritizing measurable outcomes, uniform curricula, and predictable testing structures that could be applied across large populations. It is undeniably easier to grade memorized answers than to evaluate original reasoning, easier to scale lectures than to manage dynamic debates, and easier to maintain order in a silent classroom than to facilitate controlled intellectual chaos. And the Socratic method, by its very nature, introduces controlled chaos, unpredictability, and emotional intensity that demand highly skilled teachers, smaller groups, and significant time investment. Time is expensive. Training educators in advanced questioning techniques is demanding, and large institutions often prioritize systems that maximize efficiency over those that maximize depth. What gradually replaced this ancient approach was a model centered on passive consumption, where students sit quietly, listen to information delivered in prepackaged formats, write notes mechanically, and prepare primarily for standardized evaluations. This cycle became simple and repetitive. Sit, listen, write, memorize, test, forget, and then move on to the next unit with little integration of previous knowledge into a coherent framework. Meanwhile, high performers in business, law, medicine, and entrepreneurship never fully abandoned this questioning mindset, even if they were not consciously labeling it as the Socratic method. Top executives challenge assumptions in meetings. Elite lawyers dismantle arguments in courtrooms, and successful entrepreneurs constantly interrogate their own ideas before investing time and resources into execution. Without necessarily realizing it, they are practicing disciplined questioning, playing devil's advocate with themselves, and stress testing their reasoning before making decisions that carry real-world consequences. Consider a simple but powerful story of a medical student who struggled to remember vast amounts of textbook material and felt overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information required for exams. Instead of recommending another textbook or additional hours of reading, a professor instructed him to create 5 thoughtful questions for every page he studied and then attempt to answer them from memory without looking at the text. Within a few months, his retention improved dramatically, his understanding deepened, and his performance on exams increased significantly, even though the content itself had not changed at all. The only variable that changed was the method, shifting from passive input to active output, from reading and rereading to questioning and reconstructing knowledge from within. Most people mistakenly focused almost entirely on input, believing that more videos, more books, more courses, and more information automatically translates into more competence and more intelligence. But true learning is defined not by what you consume, but by what you can produce without assistance. Because production reveals understanding, while consumption often creates the illusion of progress. If you cannot explain a concept clearly in your own words, defend it against objections, and apply it in new contexts, then you do not truly understand it, no matter how many times you have read about it. One of the major reasons this method faded from mainstream classrooms is discomfort, because being questioned publicly triggers fear of being wrong, fear of judgment, and fear of embarrassment. Yet paradoxically, that very discomfort builds resilience, confidence, and composure under pressure, qualities that extend far beyond academic performance and influence career success and social dynamics. Another factor is control, because a classroom built on questioning empowers students to analyze, challenge, and occasionally reject presented ideas rather than accepting them passively. When individuals learn to question effectively, they develop independent judgment, and independent thinkers are inherently less predictable and more difficult to standardize within rigid systems. Speed also played a role because deep dialogue and thoughtful debate require time, patience, and reflection. While modern productivity culture often rewards rapid coverage of material over thorough comprehension, slow thinking, however, produces durable insight, and durable insight consistently outperforms superficial familiarity. When applied to complex real-world challenges, you can begin applying this method immediately by transforming the way you interact with information, starting with a simple shift from highlighting and rereading to interrogating and reconstructing. Whenever you encounter a new idea, ask yourself why it is true, what assumptions support it, what evidence could disprove it, how you would explain it to a child, and what real-life examples demonstrate its validity. By doing this consistently, you move from being a passive sponge that absorbs information superficially to becoming an active sculptor who shapes knowledge deliberately and strengthens it through pressure. Studying with another person can amplify this effect, especially if you alternate roles between teacher and challenger, forcing each other to defend ideas clearly and respond to counterarguments without notes. Beyond memory improvement, this method enhances communication skills, critical thinking, composure under pressure, and the ability to articulate complex thoughts coherently in conversations, presentations, and negotiations. In a world where artificial intelligence can store and retrieve vast amounts of information instantly, the ability to think critically, adapt reasoning, and ask better questions becomes a defining competitive advantage. We now live in an era of unlimited access to answers, yet the skill of formulating powerful questions has become increasingly rare. Even though life outcomes are often determined by the quality of the questions we ask ourselves, better questions lead to better decisions lead to better actions, and better actions ultimately shape better results across personal and professional domains. You do not need institutional permission to adopt this approach, nor do you need a formal classroom environment, because disciplined questioning can be practiced anywhere with intention and consistency. The next time you watch an educational video, pause it periodically to summarize the main points allowed from memory, challenge the logic presented, and articulate whether you agree or disagree and why. When reading a book, close it at the end of each chapter and attempt to reconstruct the key arguments without looking, identifying gaps in understanding and reinforcing them through deliberate recall. Treat learning as a structured mental workout, understanding that just as muscles grow stronger under tension, the brain becomes sharper under the strain of retrieval, analysis, and defense of ideas. Most people prefer quick tips and instant hacks that promise improvement without discomfort. But deep mastery has always required effort, reflection, and the willingness to confront intellectual weakness honestly. Imagine yourself 6 months from now after consistently applying this questioning discipline, speaking more clearly, thinking more rapidly, remembering more accurately, and feeling less intimidated in high-pressure conversations. For the next 7 days, challenge yourself to write 5 meaningful questions after learning anything new and answer them from memory without consulting your notes, observing how your attention and confidence evolve. You may discover something surprising and liberating. You are never inherently bad at studying or incapable of deep understanding, but simply trained in a system optimized for memorization rather than reasoning. The method may have faded from most classrooms, but it remains available to anyone willing to embrace discomfort, cultivate curiosity, and prioritize depth over speed. Information is everywhere and increasingly cheap, but disciplined thinkers who can question, analyze, and articulate ideas with clarity are rare and extraordinarily valuable. The decision now rests with you, because you can continue studying the way most people do and achieve average results. Or you can adopt a method that demands more effort yet produces disproportionate rewards. In a world overflowing with data, choose to become someone who thinks deeply rather than someone who merely consumes endlessly, because thinkers shape the future while passive consumers simply observe it.